Welcome back to Kris versus everybody. I'm your host, Kris. This is the podcast where I talk about anything unedited, uncensored, unapologetic. No filters, no fluff, just real talk. This episode has been brought to you by the Crisscross Corner and Crisscross Corner on Crisscross Studios and the YouTube page. If you're listening on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, hit that follow button to stay up to date with every new episode as it drops. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for your support. Except for the people in the KKK, because that's what I'm about to talk about today. The KKK. Here's a question that should stop this country in its tracks. How is it that one of the most violent, organized, ideologically driven hate groups in American history, not officially labeled as a terrorist organization? I'm talking about the Ku Klux Klan, KKK for short. Cross burnings, lynchings, church bombings, political intimidation, murder, generations of fear. So why, after all that, does the United States still refuse to call the KKK what it very clearly is? It's clearly a terrorist organization. So let's talk about the basics so y'all can really get it, because I like to talk in clear terms so people don't sound lost. Terrorism is defined as a use of violence or intimidation, especially against civilians, in pursuit of political or ideological goals. That's not debatable. That's not partisan. That's the definition of terrorism. Applied to the KKK. Now let's go down the list of what I just talked about, what terrorism is. The Klan used violence to suppress Black political power. Yes, they did. They terrorized communities to enforce racial hierarchy. They bombed churches. They assassinated leaders. They intimidated voters. They operated in cells. They spreaded propaganda. They coordinated across states. If a foreign group did 1/10 of what I just listed off, we'd have no hesitation calling them terrorists. But because the KKK is domestic, and because its victims were largely African Americans, the label suddenly gets complicated. And that tells you everything you need to know. The truth is, the KKK wasn't just a fringe group. At multiple points in US history, it was intertwined with local governments, law enforcement, the courts, and the political system. Sheriffs wore the robes. Judges wore the robes. Politicians benefited from the fear. Labeling the KKK as a terrorist organization would require acknowledging that terrorism wasn't just external. It was domestic, tolerated, and at times protected by the state. And America struggles with that truth. Another reason, the legal framework. The United States government is far more comfortable designating foreign terrorist organizations than domestic ones. Why? Because domestic designation runs into the First Amendment and the freedom of speech issues. But here's the uncomfortable part. Those protections are selectively enforced. We found ways to prosecute Muslim Americans, environmental activists, and political radicals under terrorism-related statutes without blinking. Yet when it comes to white supremacist groups, suddenly the system becomes cautious, procedural, and delicate. That's not neutrality, that's bias. And let's be clear, the issue isn't that the law can't label domestic terrorist organizations, it's that it chooses not to, especially when those organizations reflect power structures the country has never fully dismantled. Calling the KKK a terrorist organization would force America to confront its own origin story, because the Klan wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't an extension of slavery by other means, an enforcement arm of white supremacy when laws changed but beliefs didn't. You can't label that terrorism without also admitting it was systemic. And that scares people. There's also a myth that the KKK no longer exists or is no longer relevant. I live in Michigan. I know where my KKK people are, and I stay clear away from those areas too. The ideology, I can't speak today. The ideology didn't disappear. It's just rebranded. It moved online. It splintered into the militias, the neo-Nazi groups, and the lone wolf actors who commit violence inspired by the same beliefs. Like Dylan Roof, like the Buffalo shooter, like the Uvalde shooter. Terrorism doesn't require matching robes. It just requires a shared ideology and violent intent. And the refusal to label the KKK as terrorists sends a dangerous message. It's the message that some forms of political violence are more understandable and more forgivable or more American than others, which is scary. So ask yourself this: whose fear was considered legitimate? Whose lives were deemed expendable? Whose trauma was minimized? Because terrorism isn't defined by who commits it, it's defined by what it does. And what the KKK did and continues to inspire to this day in 2026 fits that definition perfectly. This isn't about symbolism. Labels matter. Terrorist designation affects surveillance, funding, enforcement priorities, education, and historical clarity. Refusing to use the label is a form of denial, and denial doesn't protect democracy, it erodes it. So why doesn't the country label the KKK as a terrorist organization? Because doing so would require honesty about history. It would require honesty about race and racism and systemic racism. It would require honesty about who violence has been allowed to target without consequence. It would require admitting that terrorism didn't just come from abroad. It wore suits, badges, robes right here in the United States. The real question isn't whether the KKK meets the definition of terrorism, because we all know it does. The real question is whether this country is willing to confront the truth that some of its greatest threats were never foreign enemies, but domestic ones it refused to name. Donald Trump, on his first day in his second term, labeled the cartels as international terrorists. And the country cheered. I didn't cheer, but I did agree that the cartels were an international terrorist group. However, events that happened this month of him hosting a video with Barack Obama and Michelle Obama as monkeys, apes to be specific, shows that, hey, that ideology is shared with the KKK. They believe that Black people are less than. And until we're honest about history, race, racism, and systemic racism, the words never again will always ring hollow, because you can't defeat what you refuse to acknowledge. And silence, especially in the face of terror, has always been the Klan's greatest ally. So let's stand up and call your local representative to bring a bill to the floor to make the KKK a terrorist organization. And that has been another episode of Kris versus Everybody. See y'all next time.